Tonight we're very proud to have with us one of our own graduate students who's actually a Fulbright scholar studying in the Master of Architecture program, Florian Techel. He's a graduate of the Technical University of Berlin with a diploma equivalent to our Master of Architecture degree. Had studied previously at the John F. Kennedy School in Berlin. He's done lots of things in his brief but colorful career. He's worked as an apprentice with a construction firm, doing some things many of us have watched but never particularly wanted to attempt, I think. He's traveled around. We're going to hear more about that later. He's done a number of very special presentations to a variety of professional groups, including presentations on the architects Louis Kahn, and Frank Lloyd Wright. He's prepared professional papers on the sociological aspects of the work of Frank Lloyd Wright, as well as economical problems of the German building price index system. He's traveled extensively in the United States and has also spent time in Bangladesh and in Burma, which we're going to hear more about tonight. Already in the few months that he's been in Muncie, he's become a very active participant through the Energy Center in a daylight assessment program. There's a nice brochure available from Series, if you'd like to obtain a copy of that, and is becoming integral to that team. We're very proud of him in that score too. He does speak German and English and says that he studied a lot of French. I don't know how fluent that is, but help me welcome tonight Florian Techel, who will speak to us about Burma, and he'll explain how the costume he's wearing is not really the latest fashion from Berlin. Florian Techel. It's a lot easier.
What I'm wearing is not the latest fashionable outcry from Paris. This is what men wear in Burma. This is a so-called loungie, which is very practical at the high temperatures and high humidities you have down there. And only the people in Burma that are rich enough and dumb enough to afford Western clothing would, in a climate like that, buy, I call it slags. This is a Burmese jacket. Depending on the temperatures, it would be thicker or thinner. Usually it's made from cotton, so it also soaks up a lot of your perspiration. Burma. Burma is a fairly rich country. They have very fertile soil in at least parts of the country, and that allows for up to 3 crops per year. They have natural resources like oil, fish, teak wood, and gold. Burma, for a short while after its independence from Great Britain in 1948, was the biggest rice exporting nation in the world. It was called the Rice Bowl of Southeast Asia. Ever since the early 1960s, however, Burma was ruled by the Burma Socialist Program Party under the leadership of the General Ne Win. And this Burmese trail on the way to communism has led this country into absolute poverty, despair, and almost complete isolation from the rest of the world. The xenophobia has gone so far that the regime usually issues tourist visas only for 1 week. Reason being that the regime doesn't want the tourists to mingle around with the Burmese too much. Upon entry into Burma, and the only possibility to enter Burma is by airplane through the airport of Rangoon, Upon entry, any kind of photographic devices are suspiciously checked, and video cameras are completely forbidden. Co-initiated by the German Federal Republic about 3 years ago, Burma was adopted by the United Nations into the circle of the least developed nations in the world. That means that all the former development aid credits by the United Nations and the World Bank and other governments are declared lost subsidies and do not have to be paid back, neither by Burma nor its crooked or corrupt regime. In the summer of 1987, at a time when the foreign currency reserves in Burma were reduced to a mere 20 million US dollars, which is not very much at 40 million people, the unmistakable General Ne Win chartered a jumbo jet for just $2 million for a month-long summer trip with his colleagues to several spas in the middle of Europe to regain some of his strength for the tough job of being the strongman of Burma, which to me shows once again that all men are created equal, but some are more equal than others. Wouldn't this all be so sad? One actually would have to admire this general and his gang, because it doesn't seem easy to me to bring a country with so good starting conditions as Burma down to zero, but they succeeded. All this went, quote, well, unquote, for decades, with a few uprisings here and there, but nothing really dramatic, except for several underground wars, which the government is fighting against ethnic minorities ever since the middle of the 1950s. Why would the people of Burma be so indifferent to the doings of their government? I think this is explained by the mentality of Buddhist people, and Burma is among the most orthodox of all the Buddhist countries. Basically, a Buddhist person doesn't really want to intervene with the government. He wants to live in peace with his environment, and as long as the government doesn't interfere with him, he wouldn't interfere with the government, and they try to build upon that exterior peace, their inner peace. The positive side of this is that you will hardly hear anybody yelling in Burma, except for the military and some ignorant tourists. That means that if the people in Burma actually start marching in the streets, some things must be severely wrong. Indeed, they were in the summer of 1988. Remember that Burma in the 1950s was the biggest rice exporting nation in the world. In the spring and summer of 1988, the government had actually go out to the world market and buy rice on the world market, which made the price for rice actually just skyrocket within the country. All of a sudden, the supply of basic foods was not ensured anymore. I assume that most of you gathered around have an idea what the Chinese government did to its people on Tiananmen Square last year. I'm not so sure if anyone knows that just about a year before that, the Burmese government did exactly the same thing to its people. The two incidents actually are so similar that I'm inclined to lose my theory that history never repeats itself. It seems to me as if this general and his ruthless gang handed some blueprints as to how to slash a peaceful uprising of the people over to their fellow comrades in Beijing. It all started in the summer of 1988 with peaceful demonstrations led by students and Buddhist monks, which were not really recognized by the government for quite a while. That allowed for a very peaceful form of anarchy, some sort of a Soviet republic, not for the people, but by the people and of the people. However, after looking at all these happenings for a while, the regime used a completely peaceful demonstration on August 8th, 1988, to create a bloodbath just in the middle of Rangoon. As this did not seem to be enough, they created another massacre on September 19th. This time, the brutalities went on for a whole week and spread all over the country. The following story, which was passed on to me through a reliable source, might illustrate a little bit the atrocious conduct of the regime. Doctors and nurses at the General Hospital in Rangoon, after they received notice of the slashings of the government, organized a blood donation camp in front of the hospital the next morning. Despite the fact that this hadn't been broadcasted over any government channels like TV or radio, hundreds of people showed up. While they were waiting in line, all of a sudden military personnel carriers drove by, the covers flew open, and the, until then, hidden soldiers just fired at random, round after round into the defenseless crowd. Alone in this incident, dozens of people died. A doctor who wanted to free his station to accommodate victims was threatened with imprisonment or worse to keep up business as usual, because according to the military, these incidents have never happened. After that, the country became peaceful again, deadly peaceful. And of course, all what I have told you so far are lies, rumors spread by interested capitalistic circles around the world to bring the nice Burmese government to its knees. All this has never happened, at least not officially. So at least officially, there have never been somewhere between 3,000 and 10,000 people being killed. However, it is puzzling that the government, after all these not happenings, closed all schools of the countries, that is, universities down to elementary schools, for over a year. They did not reopen the elementary schools until a few months ago. It makes me wonder what this regime fears from children in the age group from 6 to 12 years. So I'm a little sorry that I couldn't start this out in any nicer way. I think what you are going to see now, however, will be nicer. So please switch on the slides. Burma is the westernmost of the so-called Southeast Asian countries. With India, China, Thailand, Malaysia, and so on. It has common borders with Bangladesh, which is there, India, Laos, Thailand, and China. Burma is approximately 220,000 square miles, and that is just about the size of Texas. Population currently counts about 40 million people. So Burma is not nearly as overpopulated as Bangladesh, and the population is not growing dramatically. This down here, that is the capital, that is Rangoon. Up there, that is the old capital, that is Mandalay. These are the so-called Shan Mountains. And all the slides that you're going to see now were taken in Rangoon, the closer vicinity of Rangoon, in Mandalay, the Shan Mountains, and in a city called Pagan, which is somewhere over here. This is the west entrance on the lower left to the Shwedagon Pagoda, which is the most important shrine of Burmese Buddhism. It is, like many pagodas, covered with gold, which means that it holds some artifacts that are important to Buddhist belief, as opposed to other pagodas that you will see that are just covered plainly white, which means that they don't hold anything special inside. Allegedly, it has more gold on its surface than the Bank of England in its safes. Now, I don't know what that says either about the pagoda or about the Bank of England. However, However, somebody gave me a figure about the weight of all the gold that is applied to it, and it comes in probably somewhere around 500 million US dollars, which is unimportant because it is not to be sold anyway. Next ones, please. The term pagoda actually is a little bit misleading. Pagoda simply defines any kind of place for meditation or worship that has any kind of building, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that form. So what you're going to see here with this characteristic pile form, that is a so-called stupa. So every stupa is a pagoda, but not every pagoda is a stupa. The Shwedagon stupa, being such an important building, is accompanied by 49 little stupas. 49 is a holy number in Buddhism, as it is 7 times 7, so that is a number that allegedly brings a lot of luck. The current form of these stupas has been developed about 300 years ago, and ever since has been varied slightly, but the overall concept of the order remained. Next ones. That is, at the top, you have the so-called crown of the stupa. In this case, it is just covered over and over with emeralds, rubies, diamonds. In fact, I think on the very tip is a very, very precious diamond. All these things here are not even gold plates, they're massive gold pieces. So that is the crown. The thing under it is the so-called banana bud. Then you have a rim of so-called tender lotus. What you see on the left here, that is lotus, which is a fairly important flower in Burma. Then you have the upright lotus, the inverted lotus, and again a column of tender lotus. This down here is a flipped around alms bowl. As Buddhist monks shall only, how shall I say, feed themselves by alms they get from other people. So that is symbolized that way. I was talking about that the Shwedagon stupa is just surrounded by all these other stupas, and that's what you see here. It's almost like a sacred village. It's up on that hill, and of course you have to take off your shoes. That is one of the major things to do wrong in any Buddhist country, not to take off your shoes in the holy places. And then it is not exactly requested, but it is good luck if you circle the stupa in clockwise. So you always have the stupa on your right. Temperatures, I was in Burma pretty exactly a year ago. Daily temperatures were in the 80s, 90s, and the sun was shining pretty hot. So you can imagine that in the late afternoon, these stones were rather warm, not to say hot. So without any shoes, that was quite an undertaking. Now, for Buddhist people, it is not really that important on what day of the year they were born. It is much more important on what day of the week they were born. And according to that day that they were born, certain characteristics apply to them, very much like they do with our astrologers, saying that if you're a Taurus, you have these characteristics, and if you're Scales, then you have another characteristic. Now, at any one of these, so the Burmese week is split up into 8 days. The Wednesday counts twice. That is because 7 doesn't really spread around, what shall I say, a stupa very easily. So they split it up in 8 sectors. And at every one of these day poles, on the lower right you see one of them, a good Buddhist would go there at least once a week, preferably on the day that he was born, water that little Buddha as many times as he is years old, and bring offerings like little paper umbrellas, which should symbolize shade and cover that you give to these to the Buddha, and then again it would be reflect on your personal life. Any kind of flowers, greeneries, and so on as a symbol of fertility. Next one. This is a tourist hotel, the Karawijk Hotel, which was built by that General Ne Win to somewhat compete against the Shwedagon Pagoda. You see, this place was picked deliberately. However, it doesn't match up, and it is pretty well not recognized by the Burmese people. It is some sort of an unbuilding. However, we went there one evening for a dance performance. And as they tell me, these are very typical Burmese dance costumes. They're very colorful, embroidered with gold and silver and precious gemstones. The figures that are symbolized by the men in this company are mythological figures of Burmese mythology. Next one. And then you see buildings in Rangoon that at least remind me somewhat of the tales of 1001 Night, even though this is quite a little bit away from the Orient. But there must have been at least some sorts of exchange. On the lower left, you see a famous Buddhist monk who was, how shall I say, covered with all kinds of things like they did with the mummies in Egypt, so they won't deteriorate. And allegedly, he has laid there for over 100 years already. And another thing that the Burmese people like to do is to make oversized Buddha figures. This Buddha figure is approximately 250 feet long. Again, is covered with all kinds of precious gemstones. And it is somewhat funny to see that the Buddha figure itself is so very precious and taken very, very great care of. However, the building around it that keeps it dry from the elements is just like a machine assembly hall. They don't take any care about the building that surrounds the thing. It is the Buddha figure itself that they focus on. What is typical in Burma is, as you might have seen on the, no, you did not see that on the Shwedagon Pagoda, that unlike Catholic or traditional Christian belief, the Burmese and the Buddhists don't really have any problems mingling the religion and commerce. So basically on the staircases to any one of these shrines, you find all these dealers that have all kinds of things, from foods over cigars to little woodworks, whatever you can think of. This was a pretty dramatic reminder to me that Burma also bared quite a big share in World War II. All these, this is a British war cemetery in which all the British soldiers and the Burmese soldiers that fought on the British sides are buried. You might not see this, but these columns are just covered from the bottom to the top with names, very much like the Vietnam Memorial in Washington. Next ones. Traffic. These are fairly modern buses, at least for Burmese standards. On the upper left, you see a 1942 Chevrolet bus, which runs as good as ever. The one on the lower right is even older than that, and it also runs. You see that the Burmese take very good care of not letting any space go away unused. So waste in Burma is, or waste and Burma, that is like a contradiction. Everything is used. Everything is used and reused and recycled and turned into something else. It's unbelievable. Next. So what you see on the lower right are leftovers from World War II. And if the chassis breaks, they'll just take off the body and put it on another chassis. If the body breaks, they'll just take it off and weld it. And really, nothing is left unused. You see on the upper right hand, that was a, how shall I say, a truck. And I bet you in 2 weeks after that, it again would have been a truck. Motor cars are still rather unusual, not affordable by the average people, so pedal power is much more what the average person in Burma would use. So what you see on the upper pictures are the average Burmese taxis. They're so-called trishaws, as opposed to the lower ones, which are so-called tuk-tuks, probably reflecting on the sound that the motor makes. All of which you will find in Rangoon, especially the motor cars. As soon as you get into the back part of the country, you will rarely find those motor cars. Next picture. The classic transportation media in all of Bangladesh is still the so-called horse car, which is very efficient. It carries about 3 or 4 Western tourists, and I've seen up to 9 Burmese people in one of these horse cars. However, what you might find is that 1 horsepower and 1 horsepower is not exactly the same. That can vary dramatically. It makes for a very peaceful little rocky ride, and it basically gets you everywhere. What you might find here is that this little sack even recycles the, how can I say, the leftovers of the burning process of the motor. Next ones. And then, probably because just by the time that I went to Burma, I had just finished a design project in Berlin for a bus stop. I was intrigued by the great variety of bus stops that they have in Burma. Hardly any one of them look alike. They're made from wood, from plastic, or at least the covers are made from plastic, from steel, from zinc, whatever you can think of. These are the more modern versions, but they also, this is actually a very old tradition of having some sort of shelters along the road. Next one. The one on the lower left, for example, is over 100 years old. The stems of that thing are probably 1 foot to 1.5 feet thick, massive teak wood, and that is virtually indestructible. And you, like I said, back in the countryside, you find lots of these things along the road, long before buses have existed or any kind of public transportation. And then they tell you that Buddhists believe in reincarnation. Maybe I'm oversimplifying this a little bit, but as far as I understood, what a Buddhist believes is that if he is reincarnated, when he is born again, as what he will be born again is a reflection of his conduct in his earlier life. So if he led a bad lifestyle, he will be not elevated on the ladder of existence. He might be born again as an ant. If he conducted himself well, which of course every Buddhist hopes to, the ultimate step would be to get into nirvana. So this is the reason why a lot of the richer people donate a fair amount of their income to poor people or for public interest, things like that, to increase their karma, which means about their standing for the future world. Now, a few pictures from commerce, some scenes from the marketplaces in Rangoon, and I think a few are from Mandalay too. You might want to notice these interesting symbols, which probably just have this problematic attitude to a lot of Westerners and especially Germans. In a lot of Asia, this symbol just means good luck, still to this very day. I don't know if it comes across, but in these markets in Rangoon, you practically can buy anything. You could buy an expensive Japanese camera, you can buy the pencil sharpener, and you can just buy average goods. Reason behind that is because most of the Western goods there are black market goods, and if you have enough Western currency, it's no problem to buy them. Problem is most Burmese people don't. This kind of black market has been sanctioned by the government And I didn't understand that for a while, but then they told me a lot of the generals, a lot of the officers, or the wives of the officers of the military regime are just heavily involved in the black market. They make a lot of money that way. On the upper left, you see a Burmese apothecary, a drugstore. On the upper right, a paper supply store, which in Burma is the same as a bookstore. Sometimes they have books with print in them. A lot of times they just have white pages, and you have to write in them. The souvenir shop of the traditional kind on the left, and a traditional souvenir shop of the modern kind on the right. And you see these things are probably just international. Like I said, if you have money, you get everything in Burma. Problem is, most of the people cannot afford this. Well, and then you take a ride off into the countryside using this train that was built by the British, I think at the turn of the century, and hasn't been really redone ever since, especially not since the British took off in 1948, which makes for the, how shall I say, the tracks are very narrow. And this, plus the fact that they're not very well maintained, makes for a very gentle, very rocky ride. Also, the trains aren't very fast. So I think that trip from Rangoon up into the Shan Mountains is maybe 250, 300 miles long. It takes about a day. But again, time is something that I realized in Burma is something very relative. So if you're just riding there and enjoying yourself, it can be very worthwhile. Up there in the mountains, those railroad tracks often are the only way of connecting a town with another. So as the train is only going twice a day, once up into the mountains, and in the evening it's coming back down from the mountains, during the other times, it's just used as a pedestrian footwalk. And every time the train stops, it's like a spontaneous market on the train station. You can buy almost everything from melons over water, which I wouldn't recommend. So Montezuma's revenge wouldn't struck you. Basically, you can buy anything. And as a Westerner with a pale face, you know, of course, you're like the story of the whole train station. And the train hasn't really pulled in and stopped. Everybody is just gathering around the window, and it just spreads like incredibly fast. Problem is they cannot communicate with me, I cannot communicate with them. Basically, you can just point at certain things and say you want them, which is too bad. Sometimes, how shall I say that the path into the mountains becomes so steep that the train cannot make it in one way. So basically what it does, it comes up here, moves into the train station over there, and somebody flips the switch, then the train comes back over here. Goes over the switch again, stops, somebody flips the switch, then we come back around here, and this goes on for 5 or 6 times. And again, it's just you're just enjoying yourself, looking out of the window, looking what the operators of the train system do. What you see on the lower left is one of the bigger train stations. This is something pretty big, very important. And this also is a photograph that I was never allowed to take. The fear of the government goes so far that you're not allowed to photograph any kind of airport, military installation, school, train station. Basically, you're just allowed to photograph non-military people and pagodas. Everything else is just restricted by the government, as they fear that you might get some military advantage of it. What you see on the lower left is a typical Burmese school. There are just all these very linear buildings with the entry on the front, on the outside, and then the school rooms just go over to the other side. These so-called Shan Mountains are those very fertile areas that I talked about earlier, where they really have like 3 crops a year. This soil is just incredibly rich. And then you come to this thing. Again, there are military patrols in front of it, as in front of any kind of important building. And you walk up there into some big caverns. In these caverns, you find virtually thousands and thousands of Buddha statues from all kinds of time eras. The story at the beginning, what they told me was that a lot of tribes within Burma or within that region hundreds of years ago were at war with one another constantly, and they would also destruct these very precious artifacts of their belief. So being very pragmatic, what they did is that they just carried all these things off to these caverns so that they wouldn't be found by the enemies. Over the decades and centuries, this was just like a huge museum that built up, which cannot really be described by the pictures. It's just a glimpse of what you get here. I'm sorry. Buddha statues in all kinds of, from very small stone carving to very precious gold covered, all kinds of histories. What might also be worthwhile to point out is that the aesthetics of these Buddha statues has also altered over the years. What you see, or what you might have a feeling of, is that the Buddha looks rather unhuman. This has developed probably like 200 years ago, that the people wanted to make the Buddha statues look more superhuman. And that's why a lot of the features of these figures are very, almost abstract. You see, for example, that all the fingers on the hands are exactly the same length. That should underline the superhumanness. You find that the ears are just grossly oversized. How shall I say it? The head often is extended like that, which is a special, one of the postures in which a Buddha can be found. This one, where the head extends up to the top, means that the Buddha is just in the phase of enlightenment, that he's basically just about to enter nirvana. You find quite a few of the Buddha figures in that way. And then you find completely different things outside, like these water buffaloes, which are very important for a farmer in Burma. This water buffalo would be at least as important as a tractor for a farmer in the United States. And often enough, these huge animals that easily weigh a ton are just maneuvered by these 7 or 8 year old children, like on the upper right, without any fear. It's just very common. It's what they grew up with, and they just deal with these huge animals without any kind of fear. Another touristy site up in the Shan Mountains is the so-called Inlay Lake, which is basically just the bottom of like a mountain ridge where all the water from the mountains just flows into. Because it's not very narrow, the lake is not very steep. Basically, after the rainy season, we're talking about 20 feet, and when it's dry, it's just like 10 feet on the deepest parts of the lake. So if the boat capsizes, you might as well just walk home. The people that live on that inlay lake they just live on the lake, and they live with the water. In fact, what the tourist guide told us is that children of these people, before they learn to walk, they know how to swim. So what you have there is some sort of like a Venice of Burma, or of Southeast Asia. All these villages are built in the lake. It's like, again, massive teak logs that are just rammed into the earth, and then those houses are built high enough so that the high water level will just not get into the living room. Pardon me. And then the basic means of transportation is just going around in a boat. What they tend to do is that they grow a lot of flowers or crops on the lake. They basically just take these little seedlings into like a little garden on the water, let them grow up, and then they just weave them into like flower ponds that they're just floating on the water. As soon as they're big enough and are able to float by themselves, they're just cut out from the school, dragged over to wherever it should flourish, and then they put some poles into the ground there, and that's where it grows. Usually these things have, like on the lower right here, have a life expectancy of 4 or 5 years, after which they will just sink to the ground, and then you would put another one over it. After a while, little islands in the lake just start building up, and then you again have massive soil on which you could build some sort of like religious shrines and so on. It is very known for the flowers that they grow there on the lake. And then we're in a completely different part of the country again. Now we're in Pagan, which is an area where in the 11th and 12th century, a mad king, of which I forgot the name, was just driven by the idea to build as many pagodas as possible. And basically, this area at that time, they tell me, was a rainforest, after which it was just a desert. He did pretty much the same thing as the Romans did on the northern coast of Africa. So he completely changed around the climate and the vegetation of that area. All of the pagodas are from that area, but that's basically when the major thrust started, and so major part of the construction was done during that time. Pagodas, the larger ones that you just saw in the last two cycles, are like somewhat similar to a modern idea in architecture that some German architects like to play around with. That is like, I always call that the Madrushka phenomenon, like, you know, these little puppets that they have in Russia where they have the puppet and the puppet and the puppet and the puppet. Just as well here, you have the almost like a pagoda and the pagoda and the pagoda and the pagoda, some 3 or 4 layers within one another. And believe me, there is nothing nicer than to sit on one of these pagodas and see the sun set in the west. These pagodas have heated up during the day, so during the daytime they're basically fairly cool. But as soon as the sun goes over the horizon, you have this massive heat radiating from the back. It's just very, very beautiful. Yeah, this king, as I said, was some sort of a maniac. He allegedly went around the building site every now and then and tried to stick the knife of his, the blade of his knife into any one of between the bricks of the masonry wall. And if he succeeded doing so, the mason was decapitated immediately. On the upper right, you might notice how one of these typical Burmese roofs is constructed on the inside. And again, on the lower right, you see one of these monstrous Buddha figures over and over covered with gold. And it's completely covered with a completely unnoticeable building. So unless you know that the Buddha figure is there in that building, which is absolutely not worth mentioning, you would never know. Again, that's not relevant to the Burmese people. They don't really care that much about outer appearances. As long as they know the Buddha is there, that's fine. Basically, until the horizon, this whole field, it's dozens of square miles large. It's just covered over and over with little, bigger, and very big pagodas. This is another, how shall I say, very important Burmese shrine, the so-called Mount Popa. And I was just intrigued aesthetically. I mean, this is again a very old architectural ideal to have that little setting on top of the hill, and basically everybody wonders how you get up there. Well, you are able to get up there, but it's a steep climb. You start out down here, and you climb around the back, and you come up there. Along the way, you find a lot of these apes, and they just very readily approach you because they almost expect you to feed them with peanuts. However, if you do, immediately they're all over you, so you much rather don't. Up there, a lot of Buddhist monks live, and even though they welcome everybody to come up there, they themselves rarely go down into the village or into the valley. In fact, it's one that a lot of peasants from the environment, from the vicinity, they climb up and provide them with food and water and everything. So they basically choose this seclusion and this isolation up there to do nothing but meditate. So, talking a little bit about trades. There are a lot of very beautiful, how shall I say, handworking trades in Burma. This is so-called lacquer ware, which is basically a technique of where you cover any kind of surface with a color, and then you have a very fine needle, and then you start scratching these motifs into it, and you cover it with another layer of color, and again you start scratching very fine little motifs out of it. Depending on the amount or the number of different layers of colors, these things can be very cheap or very, very expensive. That's a Burmese cigar manufacturing plant. This is how glass is made. Wood carving. Stone carving. This is another very famous trade in Mandalay, the old capital of Burma, so-called silk weaving. This is a work that can only be made by little girls. Well, probably could also be made by little boys, but traditionally it's made by little girls. As the fingers of the people, as soon as they're over the age of 15, are just too clumsy to do this fine work. And they're just brilliant, absolutely meticulous, almost like machine made, although they tell me there is no machine that could make things as detailed as that. Or silk embroidering. Told you earlier that all the a lot of the stupas are covered with gold. A lot of the Buddha figurines in these pagodas are also covered with gold. Now, it's one thing that you can do individually is you can buy a little amount of gold leaf, give it to one of these monks, and then he will apply it for you onto one of these Buddhist, onto one of these Buddhas, or onto one of the stupas. And again, that would just increase your karma and make you feel better. Now, that gold leaf is pondered by these people, as you see on the upper left, and the sound is just breathtaking. It's incredible. And basically they start out with a little nugget that is rarely bigger than 1/8 of an inch, and they just put it in layers of paper, and then they just start pondering away on it several times, and then the layers are changed again and pondered again for days, until in the end you come up with a layer of gold leaf that is so thin that if you just throw it up in the air, it just levels in the air. It takes minutes till it falls down to the ground. You you see the women have this special powder on their fingers so the gold leaf doesn't stick to their fingers. The paper for this gold leaf, and between the gold leaves are just stacked and pondered away on, again is a special kind of bamboo paper, which, as they tell me also, can only be handmade, and that's what these women down there do. That's down in that cellar on the lower left, and it has to be a very moist atmosphere so the paper doesn't dry out. It has to be dark, again, for the quality of the paper, which makes, again, outrageous, loud atmosphere. Most of these women are absolutely completely deaf. Another fairly famous thing of Mandalay is the wood trading place, where always these pairs of two water buffaloes work just as well as caterpillars do in the United States. This is the Mandalay Hill, which again has a fairly important shrine on its top, where this one Buddha statue is on the lower right. Allegedly, that Buddha, centuries ago, stood at that point and just pointed in the direction and said, there is where the future capital of Burma should be built. So Mandalay was built there, and to recognize that, all these things on the Mandalay Hill were built. What you see on the lower left are two lions, or at least the Burmese interpretation of a lion. Now, lions do not exist naturally in Burma, so the only knowledge that the Burmese have of lions are through tales. And this is their mythological interpretation of what a lion would look like. What you see here is a huge square, basically the whole center of the town, of the city of Mandalay. It's about 1.5 by 1.5 square miles, and that is the former palace of the king. Now, during World War II, actually in the last weeks of World War II, a British bombshell flew into that king's palace, and the whole king's palace was built from teak wood. So all the buildings in that king's palace burned down to the ground, except for one building, this one, which was donated by the king 20 or 30 years earlier to a monastery. So that building was disassembled in the king's palace, was reassembled about a mile away from there. So that is actually the only leftover from that old king's palace. Just gives you a glimpse of how beautiful the whole assembly must have been. This is not, as I always used to joke, the biggest, how shall I say, pagoda assembly plant, but in fact the biggest book of the world. Again, one of those many kings of which I don't remember the name, made his, I'll call stonemasons, write down or carve into these stones all the important scriptures out of the Buddhist religion onto these plates. So this is basically like the Bible or like the Quran, The same thing for Buddhist belief. And in every one of these little stupas, there's one of these plates, and virtually hundreds of them. So you see here, this, for example, would be a stupa that has no precious artifacts in it. It's just a meditation place, nothing special. So it's just painted plain white. Somewhere close to Mandalay, about an hour downstream on the river, are a few buildings, again by another kind of maniac Burmese king, who wanted to build the biggest things. He wanted to build the biggest pagoda on the upper. He wanted to pour the biggest bell, and also to build the biggest lion's figures. The only thing that still works today is that bell. And in fact, that is truly the biggest working bell in the world. The biggest bell of the world in the Kremlin in Moscow has a crack, and therefore it has never rung, but this actually works. And they tell me if you stand in that bell and somebody ponders on the outside, it just blows out your eardrums. That is a hill or a little town close to Mandalay called Sagain, which is just famous for being covered all over with pagodas. Again, very beautiful to watch the sunset. And then you're walking through the rice fields, and all of a sudden you find a beautiful old monastery, like on the lower left, and it's just rotting away. Nobody takes care of it. There are just a few Buddhist monks living in there. There's no money for it, except for the monks themselves. Nobody cares about it. And so this beautiful building is just literally falling apart. What you see on the upper left, on the upper right, is a jacaranda tree, which is just famous for its beautiful blossoms. On the lower right, you see bamboos, and on the lower left, you see the stem of about a 110, 120-year-old teak wood tree. As a, how shall I say, to resemble the size on the top of it is my little camera. And the forest that you see on the upper left is about 20 to 30-year-old teak wood forest. Trees are just about not even a foot in diameter. And that is another, an ecological as much as a cultural problem in Burma. Now, as the government is in incredible economic problems, they're just selling away their beautiful teak forests to the people of Thailand and so on. And they're just cut away like the American rainforests are by the Japanese and so on. So there's another climatic catastrophe building up there. You've seen a lot of countryside of a, as I find, very beautiful country, but I think the most beautiful thing about Burma are the people of Burma. And I hope that following pictures will just underline that. Burmese are currently suffering under the ruthless regime of the military. However, it is the orphans in Burma that suffer the most, as the government takes so little care of them that it is practically not worth mentioning. I visited 2 orphanages which have to take care of the children at a rate of 15 cents per child per day. That includes food, clothing, shoes, books, and, when older, the school uniform. This has been hard in the last years, but since the rice price exploded, it is practically impossible. If not for the support of Western non-profit organizations, they virtually could not exist. The work of these non-profit organizations is systematically obstructed by the government. Some of them are existing at the verge of illegality and need to ask for the help of international diplomats on a regular basis. So I'm asking you if you leave for a small donation, and I can assure you that any donation that you would want to make is greatly appreciated. And through connections that I have to Burma, which I cannot explain more explicitly, I am assuring you that every cent of it will in fact reach these children and not feed the corrupt regime. Thank you. Any questions? I have family connections to Burma, so that was the trigger for the whole thing. And a month later, I can assure you that I didn't resent going there. I'm not sure that I understand your question. Well, I don't think that I tried to gain anything in a professional way, except for the fact that I think that if you're open-minded enough and just go places and just are willing to accept, to find new impressions, that of course, in the long run, this will affect your ideas and probably my way of designing. But there was nothing immediately architectural that I was looking for. Yeah, that is, I don't know the German name for that. Is there a thing called sandalwood or so? That is a special kind of tree, which they just take the bark of that tree and they just grind it till it turns into a powder, and they either apply that powder immediately on their skin, or they turn it into a cream by just mixing it with oil and so on. And they're just various intensities. I would say basically every Burmese woman applies that to her skin. It's just a matter of how intense. Usually they just do it with a very thin layer. You rarely see that. Some of them actually use it to almost mask themselves with they have the most beautiful motifs. They have like little leaves on their cheeks. And allegedly this makes for a nicer skin, or makes her skin look nicer for a longer time. I don't know if that holds true, but I can tell you most Burmese people, women and men, have beautiful skin. I don't think so. I think white is just a practical color, as it is pretty warm down there, and white just reflects a lot of the sun rays. I probably would think that it also has to do with the availability of pigments, or so red or blue or whatever pigments would be just more expensive than just plain white color. Well, it is typical for the British. I mean, the British occupied Burma until 1948, and this is a so-called hill station of the British military. The British officers didn't like the summers in Burma very much. I mean, they were just 100 degrees and 110% humidity, and I mean, it was just killing them. So during the summer months, they were just retreating up into the hills where it was cooler. And so it is true, up in those mountains you find a lot of British-styled houses. And in fact, the one that you saw is now like a hotel for the few tourists that still are able to go into the countryside of Burma. No, well, they are all from the country of Burma. However, Burma is made up of a lot of ethnic minorities. You have the Burmese, which are somewhat similar to the Soviet Union. You have the Russians, and then you have the Latvian people, and the Ukrainian people, and the Tajikistan people, and so on. Just that, coincidentally, the Russians, or in this case the Burmese, got the upper hand. So the people that you saw on this train ride up into the mountain, most of the time were so-called Shan people, which are the people that live in the Shan mountains. Maybe I should go a little more into depth on this too. I told you that in 1948 Burma gained independence from Great Britain, and the first president, or the first chief of government of Burma, was the General Aung San, who was some sort of a hero of the people because he led Burma into independence. Now, Aung San was basically the one who formed the Union of Burma and promised all these ethnic minorities like the Chan and the Chin and the Mon and whatever their name might have been, that Burma would become a federation, pretty much like the Federal Republic of Germany or like the United States, where there would be a lot of power delegated to the ethnic minorities, to the states. However, as Burma carried on, Aung San somewhat forgot about that. Then he was killed in by envious lieutenant, and the chiefs of government ever since also forgot about that. So that explains for these ethnic uprisings and the wars that the Burmese government is fighting ever since the middle of the 1950s, which ever since then also took a lot of the economic power out of this country. I mean, if a country is just constantly at war with itself, it cannot be the best of it. And then basically this unrest with one another also made it very easy for the Burmese Socialist Program Party to take over in this huge uprising, or just turmoil, and that basically also leads to the situation that they're in now. Well, thanks again, and thanks, Tim, for operating the slides.